She was just a waitress until she met a billionaire who had only months to live. He made one simple request of her. The diner's flickering neon cast orange shadows across the worn countertop, and Arianna Vaughn wiped down the same spot for the third time that night. Her fingers glided over the damp cloth with the precision of someone who'd repeated the gesture so many times it no longer required thought, only motion. Outside, the highway cut through the desert like an illuminated scar, and the truck headlights passed too quickly to leave any mark. She sighed, smoothed her wrinkled apron, and reached for the pen she kept in her pocket. On the paper napkin she set aside earlier, she wrote in tiny letters, "Even the moon rises for the weary." It was her secret ritual, that moment when she allowed herself to believe there was still poetry hidden between overdue bills and shifts that stretched into the early morning hours. At 2 in the morning, the diner smelled of reheated coffee and postponed dreams. Arianna served the last customer, a driver with red-rimmed eyes who barely lifted his head to thank her, and collected the coins left on the table with a weary gratitude that no longer fit into words. Every cent mattered. Every tip was one more pill for her mother, one utility bill paid on time, one less day of silent anguish. She never complained out loud, but her body knew how to tell stories her mouth kept quieted. The tense shoulders, the rough hands, the way she avoided her own reflection in the mirror behind the counter. Arianna was 28 years old, but she carried in her eyes the gravity of someone who'd already lived entire lifetimes in silence. Becky, her shift partner, emerged from the kitchen wiping her hands on her apron and threw herself onto a stool with a theatrical sigh. "Another night in paradise," she said, rolling her eyes with that dry humor that always pulled a crooked smile from Arianna. "One day we're getting out of here, Ari, I swear. We'll go somewhere coffee doesn't smell like burnt rubber." Arianna laughed softly, but didn't answer. Becky talked a lot about leaving, about fresh starts and open roads, but they both knew dreams came with a price tag, and Nevada wasn't generous with those born on the wrong side of the desert. Still, it was good to have someone who still believed in the escapes, even if they were just words tossed between one cup and the next. When the clock struck 3, Arianna hung up her apron, grabbed her worn purse, and walked out the back door. The cold, pre-dawn air hit her face like a gentle slap, and she breathed in deeply, letting the smell of grease escape her lungs. The parking lot was empty, except for her old car, a white sedan that had seen better days and now seemed determined to give up for good. She turned the key in the ignition. The engine coughed again, and then silence. Arianna closed her eyes and rested her forehead against the steering wheel, feeling exhaustion climb up her spine like a slow, inevitable wave. Not now. Please, not now. She tried twice more before accepting defeat. She got out of the car and lifted the hood, though she knew it wouldn't make a difference. She didn't understand anything about engines, and the dim light from the street lamp didn't help at all. The desert around her was a dark, indifferent vastness, dotted only by the distant lights of houses that seemed to belong to another life. Arianna crossed her arms over her chest, trying to protect herself from the cold that was already beginning to bite at her skin. She thought about calling Becky, but her friend lived on the other side of town. She thought about calling a tow truck, but this month's account was already in the red. She thought about crying, but even that didn't seem worth it. That's when the headlights appeared around the curve in the road. A car. No, it wasn't just any car. It was a black Bentley, gleaming like a jewel displaced in that arid landscape, gliding down the road with the smoothness of something that had never known potholes or hardship. Arianna narrowed her eyes, suspicious. Cars like that didn't stop in places like this. Cars like that didn't even slow down. But this one slowed and stopped, right next to the broken-down sedan, as if fate had decided to sketch a visual joke between poverty and opulence. The driver's door opened slowly, and a man stepped out, tall, wearing a slightly rumpled dark suit, gray hair tousled by the wind. He looked at her over the Bentley's hood, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. There was something strange about this encounter, something Arianna couldn't name, as if the universe had paused just long enough for this moment to exist. "Need help?" he asked, and his voice carried the weight of someone tired of something that wasn't physical. Arianna hesitated. Every fiber of her being screamed to refuse, to say everything was fine, that she could handle it on her own. But the dead car behind her and the empty night around her left no room for pride. So she nodded, and without knowing it, took the first step towards something that would change everything. Anthony Wells wasn't quite sure why he'd stopped. Maybe it was the exhaustion from the endless meeting in Las Vegas, or maybe it was something deeper, that restlessness that had been growing inside him like a silent shadow, whispering that all his fortune meant nothing if he kept driving alone down deserted roads in the middle of the night. He looked at the woman standing beside the broken-down car, arms crossed over her chest in a posture that was half defense, half surrender, and saw in her something he recognized immediately, the weariness of someone who carries the world on their shoulders and never asks for help. "Let me take a look," he said, removing his jacket and tossing it onto the Bentley's seat with a gesture that tried to seem casual but revealed the uncertainty of someone who rarely got his hands dirty. Arianna took a step back, watching as this man in an expensive suit leaned over her sedan's hood as if facing an unfathomable mystery. He frowned, ran his fingers over some cables, fiddled with things he clearly had no idea about, and then straightened up with an expression somewhere between confusion and frustration. "Honestly," he said, wiping his hands in a futile attempt to appear competent, "I don't have the slightest clue what I'm looking at here." The comment was so honest, so stripped of ego, that Arianna felt a laugh escape. Small, unexpected, but genuine. It was too absurd not to be funny. A billionaire in a Bentley pretending to know how to fix an old car at 3 in the morning. And suddenly the tension weighing on her shoulders felt a little lighter. "Could be the alternator, or the battery, or who knows what," she said, shrugging with a resignation she'd grown accustomed to carrying. Anthony glanced at her sideways, and there was something in the way his eyes gleamed under the dim streetlight, something melancholy, as if he too knew intimately the taste of defeat. "Okay, I've got jumper cables in the trunk," he offered, and before she could protest, he was already walking back to the Bentley. Arianna stood there, watching this man who seemed as out of place as she felt in her own life, and wondered what he was doing there, alone, driving down a road that didn't lead to anywhere that mattered. They spent the next 20 minutes trying to make the cables work, between confused instructions and suppressed laughter. Anthony admitted that the last time he'd opened a car hood was probably never, and Arianna confessed that her mechanical knowledge came down to turn the key and hope it works. The intimacy of the absurd united them in a strange way. There, in that empty parking lot under a starlit sky that seemed too vast for two strangers, they were just two people trying to solve a problem neither of them knew how to fix. And maybe that was exactly what they both needed, a moment where the difference between a Bentley and an old sedan didn't matter, where money couldn't buy solutions and human connection was the only currency worth anything. When the engine finally came back to life with a tired but hopeful rumble, Arianna felt a gratitude so overwhelming it almost hurt. "Thank you," she said, and the words came out carrying a weight that went far beyond this specific help. It was gratitude for him stopping, for not driving past like everyone else always did. Anthony nodded, but there was something in his gaze that seemed distant, as if he were seeing through her towards something he could no longer reach. "You're welcome," he replied, and then hesitated, as if he were about to say something important but didn't know exactly how. The silence stretched between them, full of unspoken things, until he finally asked, "Do you work here, at this diner?" "Yes, I practically live here," Arianna answered, and there was a hint of bitterness in her voice that she tried to disguise with a half-smile. Anthony nodded slowly, as if storing that information somewhere important. He returned to the Bentley, opened the door, but before getting in, he turned one more time. "Is the coffee good?" he asked. And there was something almost childlike in the question, as if the answer really mattered. "It's terrible," Arianna admitted with an honesty that surprised her. "But it's the best terrible coffee you'll find around here." He smiled then, a small but genuine smile that briefly lit up his tired face. "Then I need to come back to try this terrible coffee." And before she could respond, he got in the car and drove off, the headlights disappearing into the darkness like a promise that maybe even he didn't know if he could keep. Arianna stood there, watching the Bentley's taillights become two red dots growing smaller in the black immensity of the road, and felt something strange stir inside her chest, a mixture of curiosity and fear, of hope and disbelief. She didn't know his name, didn't know where he came from or where he was going, but somehow, in those few minutes under Nevada's starlit sky, something had changed, something small, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. Like a thin crack in a wall that seemed solid, making room for light to enter. And as she got into the car and started the engine that now worked thanks to the help of an unlikely stranger, Arianna found herself wondering if he would really come back or if that encounter would be just another one of those things that happen once in a lifetime and then dissolve into memory like smoke. 3 nights later, when Arianna poured coffee for a customer at the table near the window, she looked up and nearly dropped the pot. It was him, the man from the Bentley, sitting there as if it were the most natural thing in the world, leafing through the laminated menu with an attention that seemed disproportionate for a menu offering only 3 types of sandwiches and reheated apple pie. He wore jeans and a button-down shirt, no suit this time, and there was something different about his face, a lightness that hadn't been present that night in the parking lot. When their eyes met, he smiled, and Arianna felt her heart give a little jump that caught her completely off guard. "You came back," she said, and the statement sounded half question, half astonishment. "I said I would," Anthony replied, as if promises were things he always kept. He started showing up with a frequency that defied any logic. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, around 10 at night, Anthony Wells walked into the diner and sat at the same table, always facing the window, always ordering black coffee and apple pie, even when the pie was visibly dry. Becky nudged Arianna with her elbow every time he arrived, making a face like she knew exactly what was happening. But Arianna pretended not to understand her friend's knowing looks. There was something comforting about that unexpected routine, as if his presence brought a kind of order to the silent chaos of her nights. They talked in fragments, small exchanges about the weather, about how busy the diner was, about nothing and everything at once. And gradually, Arianna realized she looked forward to those visits with an anxiety she couldn't name. It was on one of those nights, when the diner was empty except for the 2 of them and the hum of the old refrigerator in the back, that Anthony finally talked about himself. "I never had time for this," he said suddenly, gesturing vaguely around as if this encompassed the entire simple universe of that place. To sit in a cheap place and drink bad coffee just because. "I spent my life building things, companies, buildings, deals that move millions, but I never built this." Arianna stopped wiping the counter and looked at him carefully, noticing for the first time the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the way his shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight. "And what brought you here now?" she asked gently. And there was a genuine openness in the question, not invasive curiosity, but an invitation for him to share whatever he wanted. Anthony hesitated, his fingers drumming on the edge of the coffee cup as if weighing each word before releasing it. "I was diagnosed with liver disease. Terminal." The words fell between them like stones thrown into a calm lake, creating ripples that spread in ever-widening circles. Arianna felt the ground shift beneath her feet, but forced herself to stay steady, not to let shock overtake her completely. "The doctors gave me a few months, maybe less." He said this with an almost disturbing calm, as if commenting on the weather or the taste of the pie. But his eyes betrayed another story. They were eyes that had already cried alone, that had already made peace with the inevitable, but still carried the weight of a lifetime of regrets. "I didn't come here looking for pity," Anthony continued, raising his hand as if anticipating a reaction Arianna wasn't even sure she could give. "I came because you treated me like a person. That night, when I stopped to help, you didn't ask how much money I had, didn't want anything but genuine help. And it's been so long since someone looked at me like that, as if I were just a man." His voice faltered at the end of the sentence, and he turned his gaze to the window, where his own reflection stared back at him with naked vulnerability. Arianna didn't know what to say. Words of comfort seemed too small, too empty. So she simply sat in the chair across the table, her hands resting on the worn surface, and stayed there, present, silent, offering the only thing she could, companionship without judgment. "I don't want to die alone," Anthony confessed, and there was a raw courage in that admission that broke Arianna's heart. "I don't want my last chapter to be just meetings with lawyers and paid nurses. I want to really know someone. I want conversations that matter. I want to laugh at silly things. I want to feel like I'm still human before I stop being one." Arianna felt tears sting her eyes, but blinked quickly to push them away. There was something deeply unfair about all of this, that someone with infinite resources had gotten this far in life without ever experiencing what was essential. And there was something frightening too, because she knew in that moment that if she said yes, if she opened the door for this man to enter her life, she would be choosing to feel a pain that already had a date marked on it. But when she looked at him, really looked, beyond the imaginary suit and the Bentley parked outside, beyond the money and the disease, she saw only a man who wanted to be seen. And Arianna Vaughn, who had spent her life caring for others and forgetting herself, realized that maybe this was her chance to live something real, even if brief, even if painful, even if impossible. "Okay, we can get to know each other better. No expectations, just two people who need company." Anthony raised his eyes, and there was so much gratitude in them that Arianna felt her chest tighten. He extended his hand across the table, and when she took it, it was like sealing a silent pact, an agreement to be present, to choose connection despite limited time, to transform months into something worth a lifetime. Saturday dawned with a sky so blue it seemed unreal, and Arianna found herself looking out her bedroom window with a strange feeling in her chest, something between anticipation and fear, as if she were about to jump from somewhere high without knowing if there would be water below. Anthony had called the night before, his voice sounding lighter than usual, asking if she'd be up for spending the day with him. "There's a craft fair in the next town over," he said. "I've never been to one of these things. It seems normal. I want to know what normal is." And there was so much sincerity in that request that Arianna couldn't refuse, even knowing that each yes brought her closer to an ending that was already written. She put on a simple cotton dress, tied her hair in a loose ponytail, and waited on the porch until she saw the Bentley appear around the street corner, gleaming and absurdly out of place among the modest houses in the neighborhood. The fair took place in a dusty plaza surrounded by colorful stalls selling everything, from patchwork quilts to artisanal honey and handmade jewelry. The smell of churros fried in oil mixed with the sweet aroma of cotton candy and guitar music echoed from somewhere among the tents. Anthony walked beside Arianna with an expression of genuine fascination, stopping at each stall as if discovering hidden treasures. He bought a poorly stitched leather keychain because it had personality and insisted on carrying the giant cotton candy that Arianna accepted with an embarrassed laugh. She couldn't remember the last time she'd done something like this, something with no purpose beyond simply being present, without the pressure of bills or double shifts weighing on her shoulders. And looking at Anthony, she saw that he felt the same, the temporary freedom of being just two people enjoying a sunny day. But reality has a cruel way of intruding on the lightest moments. As they stopped at a stall selling embroidered scarves, Arianna felt the stares, discreet at first, then increasingly insistent. Two older women whispered to each other, their eyes jumping from Anthony to her with a mixture of curiosity and poorly disguised judgment. Arianna knew that look. It was the look of those who saw a diner waitress next to a clearly wealthy man and drew hasty conclusions. Gold digger, opportunist, she just wants his money. The words didn't need to be spoken aloud. They were written in every raised eyebrow and every muffled whisper. She felt her face heat up, her fingers gripping her purse strap too tightly, and suddenly the sunny day seemed a little less bright. Anthony noticed the change immediately. He always noticed. There was something about him that tuned into her emotions in a way that surprised her. "Hey," he said quietly, lightly touching her elbow. "What's wrong?" Arianna shook her head, trying to smile, but the smile came out crooked and false. "Nothing. It's just people are staring." She didn't need to explain more than that. Anthony followed her gaze to the women who were now feigning exaggerated interest in a patchwork quilt, and his jaw tightened slightly. But instead of confronting them or making a scene, he simply took Arianna's hand, a simple, direct, public gesture, and intertwined his fingers with hers with a firmness that said, "I'm here, and this is real." "Let him look," he murmured, his eyes meeting hers with a gentle intensity. "They don't know anything about us, and frankly, it doesn't matter." Arianna wanted to believe that. Wanted to let the security of that touch push away all the doubts that lived coiled in her chest like sleeping snakes. But it was hard to ignore the weight of the stares, the feeling of being judged for something she could barely name. She wasn't with Anthony for the money. That she knew with absolute certainty. She was there because he saw her, because they talked about books he never had time to read, and dreams she never had the courage to chase. Because when they were together, she felt less alone, and he felt less lost. But how could she explain that to strangers who had already decided who she was before she even opened her mouth? How could she make the world understand that love, or whatever it was that was growing between them, didn't need justification or external approval? They walked to a more secluded area of the fair, where few people circulated, and sat on a worn wooden bench under the shade of a cottonwood tree. For a long moment, neither spoke. They just stayed there, side by side, watching the leaves tremble in the warm breeze coming from the desert. It was Anthony who broke the silence. "I paid off your mother's medical debts," he said, and the sentence came out so casually that it took Arianna a few seconds to process what she'd heard. She turned her head abruptly, eyes wide. "You did what?" Anthony continued looking ahead, hands resting on his knees. "I called the hospital, paid everything. And before you get mad or feel obligated to anything, it wasn't out of pity. It was because I can. And because you shouldn't be suffering with that when I have resources I don't even know what to do with." His voice was firm, but loaded with emotion, as if that simple gesture was the most important thing he'd ever done in his entire life. Arianna felt tears overflow before she could stop them. They weren't tears of gratitude alone. They were tears of relief, of liberation, of a weight that had finally been lifted from her shoulders after years pressing her against the ground. She covered her face with her hands, trying to compose herself, but the sobs came anyway, shaking her body with a force that frightened her. Anthony turned and wrapped his arms around her, holding her with a gentleness that contrasted with his physical strength, and she allowed herself to collapse there, against his chest, while the world continued spinning around them. "Thank you," she whispered when she could finally speak, and that tiny word carried the weight of all the sleepless nights, all the impossible bills, all the fears that had accompanied her since her mother got sick. Anthony kissed the top of her head, a gesture so tender it made Arianna's heart ache in a completely new way. And in that moment, under the shade of a cottonwood and away from judging eyes, she understood that loving wasn't weakness. It was the courage to accept that she didn't need to carry everything alone, that allowing herself to be cared for was an act of strength, not surrender. The sound was so soft, it almost got lost among the hum of medical equipment, a rhythmic, rapid beating that filled the room with an impossible promise of new life. Arianna lay on the examination table, eyes fixed on the fuzzy ultrasound screen, while the technician moved the transducer over her belly with precise, indifferent movements. Anthony held her hand with a grip that bordered on desperation, fingers intertwined so tightly she could feel his pulse racing against her skin. And then the image appeared, small, flickering, almost unreal, and the doctor pointed to a tiny spot pulsing on the screen. "There," he said with a professional smile. "That's the heartbeat, strong and healthy." And in that instant, the entire world reduced itself to that microscopic beating, to that fragile promise of future growing inside her, oblivious to the limited time remaining for the man who held her as if she were the only solid thing in a collapsing universe. The pregnancy had been an accident, or maybe a miracle, depending on how you chose to see it. Arianna discovered it 2 weeks earlier, alone in the diner bathroom during a shift break, staring at the 2 lines on the drugstore test as if they were sentences written in a language she couldn't read. Fear came first, quick and suffocating, followed by guilt for feeling fear when she should feel joy. But soon after came something else, a sense of purpose, that this tiny life was exactly what they both needed, even without knowing it. When she told Anthony that same night, he went so quiet she thought he'd gone into shock. But then he pulled her into a hug so tight she could barely breathe and whispered against her hair, "Thank you. Thank you for giving me this." And she knew from the tremor in his voice that this child was already loved before it even had form. The following months were a delicate dance between joy and despair. While Arianna's belly grew slowly but steadily, bearing witness to the life forming within, Anthony's body began showing visible signs of the disease consuming him from the inside. He lost weight, his skin took on a yellowish tone the doctors called jaundice, and there were days when exhaustion was so overwhelming he could barely get out of bed. But Anthony was stubborn. Stubborn in a way Arianna had never seen in anyone. He refused to give up, refused to let the disease steal the moments that remained. They continued going out, shorter trips now, more frequent breaks, but always together. He took her to watch the sunset over the Nevada mountains, settled her in a comfortable apartment near the hospital where her mother was being treated, and insisted on accompanying her to every prenatal appointment, taking notes on every detail with touching dedication. It was at one of those appointments that they discovered it would be a boy. Anthony cried when the doctor revealed the sex, cried openly, without shame, tears running down his thin face as he held Arianna's hand and stared at the ultrasound screen as if he were seeing the face of God himself. "A son!" he repeated several times on the way home, his voice wavering between amazement and a deep sadness he couldn't completely hide. "I'm going to have a son." But they both knew what he didn't say aloud, that he would probably never see that boy grow up, never teach him how to ride a bike or console him after his first heartbreak. Time was a relentless enemy, and no matter how much money Anthony had, there was no way to buy more days, more hours, more minutes beside this life he had helped create. That's when Anthony began his most important project, more important than any deal he'd closed, any fortune he'd built. He set up a makeshift studio in his home office and began recording videos, one for each of his son's birthdays, from the 1st to the 21st. Arianna would walk into the room sometimes and find him there, sitting in front of the camera, speaking to the future, as if it were a letter cast out to sea. "Hey champ, today you're turning 5. Or, happy 15th birthday. I bet you're going through that tough phase right now." He talked about love, about mistakes he'd made, about lessons he'd learned too late. He told stories from his own childhood, shared advice about money and character, about how to treat people and when to fight for things that matter. And in every video, without exception, he talked about Arianna, about how strong she was, how kind, how she had saved his life simply by existing. But recording the videos wasn't enough. Anthony wanted to ensure that his son and Arianna would never go through the hardships she had faced. So he organized everything with the meticulousness of someone who knows there won't be a second chance. He created trust funds, established investment accounts, left detailed instructions for his lawyers on how to manage the estate so that Arianna would have security, but also freedom. He didn't want her to feel trapped by his money, wanted it to be a tool for possibilities, not a gilded cage. And in every document signed, in every decision made, he made it clear that this wasn't about control. It was about love. It was about care that transcended death. It was about being present, even when he was no longer there. The weeks passed like sand slipping through fingers, and Arianna watched helplessly as the man she loved withered before her eyes. There were nights when he woke up sweating and trembling, his body fighting against the toxicity his failing liver could no longer filter. There were mornings when he got so dizzy he needed to lean on her to cross the room. But even so, even when the pain was so intense he could barely breathe, Anthony found strength to rest his hand on her belly and whisper words of love to the son who still had no name. "I want him to know," Anthony said one night, lying in the hospital bed where he spent increasingly more time, "that I loved him before I even met him. That every second I lived after learning of his existence was the happiest of my life." And Arianna, her heart broken into pieces she didn't know how to put back together, promised that yes, their son would know, that she would tell him everything, about the unlikely love that was born on a desert night, about the man who chose to truly live in the last months he had, about how true love leaves marks that time can never completely erase. The afternoon arrived with that golden light that only exists at day's end, when the sun descends slowly behind the Nevada mountains, as if it too were too tired to continue. Anthony lay in the bed facing the infinite horizon, white sheets contrasting with the pallor of his skin, and breathed with that gentle difficulty of someone saying goodbye little by little. Arianna held his hand, the same hand that had fixed her car that distant night, that had intertwined its fingers with hers at the fair, that had rested on her belly countless times to feel their son move. She didn't cry, not anymore. She had cried all the tears she had during the previous weeks, and now only a painful serenity remained. The acceptance that some loves are brief, not because they're weak, but because they burn with an intensity that ordinary time cannot contain. "You're going to be an incredible mother," Anthony whispered, his voice weak but steady, each word chosen with the care of someone who knows there will be no others. "Our boy, he's going to be lucky. He'll grow up seeing what real love is." Arianna squeezed his fingers, trying to convey through touch everything words couldn't reach. She wanted to say he shouldn't leave, that it wasn't fair, that the world was wrong to take him away when he'd finally found something worth living for. But she knew that protesting the inevitable was like screaming into the wind. It changed nothing, only exhausted the last of one's strength. So she simply nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat, and whispered back, "He'll know who you were. I'll tell him everything, about how you saved me when I didn't even know I needed saving." Anthony smiled, a small smile but genuine, that briefly lit up his exhausted face. "It wasn't me who saved you," he said, and there was a quiet conviction in those words. "You saved me, Arianna. You gave me something real when I needed it most. You gave me a reason to wake up in the morning, to feel like life still had meaning. You gave me a legacy." His hand moved slowly until it rested on her belly, where the boy moved gently, oblivious to the sadness filling that room. Anthony closed his eyes for a moment, as if engraving in memory that sensation, the movement of the life he'd helped create, the only treasure that truly mattered. And when he opened his eyes again, there was a peace in them that Arianna hadn't seen before, as if he'd finally found what he'd always been searching for. The following hours passed in slow motion, each minute stretching like taffy being pulled to its limit. Arianna's mother arrived, Anastasia, now cured and strong thanks to the treatment Anthony had funded, entered the room with tears in her eyes but maintaining composure out of love for her daughter. Becky came too, staying outside out of respect but sending her silent strength through the walls. The hospice nurse came and went discreetly, checking vital signs that gradually diminished, offering kind words no one really heard. And Anthony, at the center of that small circle of people who had learned to love him not for what he possessed, but for who he really was, said goodbye slowly, like a candle burning down to its last drop of wax before going out. "Don't be afraid," he told Arianna as twilight began to paint the sky pink and orange, "of anything. You're stronger than you know." She wanted to disagree, wanted to say she didn't feel strong, that she felt broken and lost and terrified at the idea of moving forward without him. But she knew these were the last words he had energy to say and didn't want to waste them with her own fears. So she simply leaned down and kissed his forehead, a long, tender kiss that carried all the words of love they would never have time to say. "I love you," she whispered against his warm skin. "I'll always love you." And Anthony, with the last bit of strength he had, squeezed her hand one final time and whispered back, "I know." And that makes it all worthwhile. The sun finally descended behind the mountains, taking with it the light of day and leaving only stars in Nevada's dark sky. And it was there, in that transition between day and night, between presence and absence, that Anthony Wells departed. There was no drama, no struggle, just one last gentle breath, followed by a silence that seemed to fill the entire universe. Arianna felt the exact moment he left, as if an invisible cord connecting them had been cut, leaving her adrift in a sea without anchor. She didn't move for a long time, continued holding that hand that no longer squeezed hers back, looking at the face that finally seemed rested after months carrying the weight of illness. And there, in that silent room, she made a promise that she would live not just for herself, but also for him. That she would honor that brief but intense love by being the mother their son deserved, by being the strong woman he always knew she was. 3 months later, on a clear spring morning, Arianna gave birth in the same hospital where her mother had been treated, where Anthony had spent his final days. Contractions had begun in the early hours, and she had gone through those moments of intense pain thinking of him, imagining that he would be there holding her hand if the universe had been kinder. But when the baby's piercing cry finally filled the delivery room, when the nurse placed that small being in her arms, all red and wrinkled and absolutely perfect, Arianna felt something shift inside her chest. It was as if Anthony were there, somehow, living through this boy who had his dark eyes and already showed signs of having inherited his stubbornness. She looked at her son's face, tears flowing freely now, and whispered the name they had chosen together. "Welcome to the world, little Wells. Your father would have loved so much to meet you." And in that moment, with her heart still broken but also inexplicably full, Arianna understood that true love doesn't need time. It only needs to be real, intense, and capable of leaving marks that endure forever, beating strong in every new heart that comes into the world, carrying the promise that life, despite everything, goes on.
Arianna Vaughn learned, in those brief but eternal months beside Anthony Wells, that true love isn't measured in years or decades. It's measured in the depth of the marks it leaves, in the way it transforms who we are and how we see the world. She, who had spent her entire life carrying the weight of survival alone, discovered that allowing herself to be loved wasn't weakness, but the greatest courage anyone can have. And now, holding in her arms the son who carried the legacy of that extraordinary man, she understood that some people enter our lives not to stay forever, but to teach us that we deserve true love, that we're stronger than we imagine, and that every second lived with intensity is worth more than a lifetime of half existence. Just as she discovered that love can change everything, each of us also carries that power of transformation within ourselves. Stories like this remind us that it's never too late to start over and believe in love. No matter how many times life has knocked us down, no matter how many scars we carry, there's always room for something real to be born. Even in the most unlikely places, even in the most difficult circumstances. Arianna and Anthony's love proves that human connection transcends time, money, and expectations, and that the best romances are those that transform us, that make us believe again in the beauty of vulnerability and in the courage to open our hearts even when we're afraid. Every relationship we experience, every person who touches our soul leaves an indelible mark that shapes us and prepares us for the journeys ahead. Life goes on, and with it come new opportunities to love, to start over, to write chapters whose endings we don't yet know. If this story touched you, if it awakened something inside your chest that you thought had fallen asleep, write in the comments. Love transforms lives. Let that phrase echo, not just as a comment, but as a reminder to yourself that it's worth continuing to believe, continuing to open up, continuing to choose love even when the world seems too harsh. Subscribe to Eternal Romance Stories and experience with each episode emotions that warm the soul and reflections that transform the heart. Here you'll find stories that don't just entertain, but touch deeply, that make you remember why love, in all its forms, is the most powerful force that exists. Each narrative is carefully crafted to draw you in, to make you feel, to remind you that being human is, above all, being capable of loving and being loved. And this was just one of the many stories that will still move you here.